This is The Future Of, where experts share their vision of the future and how their work is helping shape it for the better.
I'm David Blaney. For decades, the world has seen rising globalisation with cross-border flows of trade, investment, data, ideas, technology and people. But now the trend appears to be reversing. A rise in popularity of far-right politics and nationalist leaders, the impact of Brexit on the European Union and pandemic-induced nationalism have all contributed to a sense of us versus them. To discuss this topic, with us today are Curtin researchers Donna Butorac and Ben Rich. Thank you very much for coming in today, Donna and Ben.
Thank you.
Pleasure to be here, David.
Are we retreating behind borders more? And if so, how did we get here?
I think if we are, I think it's mixed. When I listen to your introduction, I think it's obviously, I would say it's probably more complex than that. But I think maybe because of decades of neoliberal globalization, we are, and there's been different things that have caused us to want to more recently because of the pandemic. There's that sense of we've needed to draw in and to cut our ties in a really physical sense in order to halt the pandemic. But I think globalization and not globalization per se, but neoliberal globalization has really caused a lot of changes in society, a lot of people to feel that they're against globalization at all. But I think it's the impact of that particular economic ideology that has dominated globalization for the past few decades. And I think one of the things it does is it shifts the concept of territoriality in really important ways. And that's probably because even though the processes might be happening within national territories, this doesn't always mean that they are national processes. So you see this disconnect between the interests of the populace and the interests of big business. And increasingly what we're seeing is that in many liberal democracies, the government has been seen to be more likely to represent and protect the interests of business. So we've seen in times of crisis that they'll bail out banks and large businesses, but at the same time impose austerity on ordinary citizens. So I think this disconnect contributes to broader feelings of disaffection with globalization as a concept rather than just that it's neoliberal globalization. So you see people wanting to move away from it, maybe at the level of the general populace. But I think it's not stopping. It goes on anyway because as we can come back to this, but there is that disconnect between who does globalization benefit and what processes are truly globalized. So we've got globalization of capital, but we don't necessarily have globalization of labor, for example. I think it's globalization that has maybe caused that disaffection and the key policies that underpin globalization. So things like trade liberalization and, free trade agreements, deregulation of capital flow and privatization of public assets. That includes natural resources. But at the same time, elimination of social welfare programs and restrictions on immigration and the free flow of labour. Those are the kind of things that have been happening, and I think they haven't always suited a lot of people. A lot of theorists would say, and said at the time, that something like Brexit was actually a vote against globalisation rather than anything else. And similarly with the vote for Trump, he was able to mobilise feelings of disaffection with the economic system that affected ordinary Americans. He mobilised that sentiment in order to get into power, I guess.
Yeah, I come at this from, in particular, the study of extremist militant ideologies. I think there's a number of reasons why there seems to be a pushback now against globalization. I would also echo Donna's sentiments, looking at neoliberalism and particularly the kind of promises that rung hollow out of neoliberalism. Neoliberalism kind of promised this global cosmopolitan identity that we would kind of transcend, our national identities, our local identities, and kind of come together in the sort of good of humanity through our common humanity. In reality, what many people have found living under regimes of globalization, living under unstable labor conditions, being bombarded by constant other forms of identity is really a sense of alienation, a sense of loss of place in the world, hyper-individualization, which itself is very much a part of the advertising kind of approach that we see in modern business, this idea that you are yourself very individual, you are very much on your own and you need to define who you are. And a lot of people find that very, I kind of think, metaphysically confronting. At the same time, this idea that, the sort of economic assumption that, labour is infinitely mobile, labour can just pick up and go, if their particular form of employment has become redundant, they can just retrain, they can just, re-specialise. Well, it's very nice, the kind of, laboratory of, economics. But in reality, people again find that very disruptive to their lives. If you've trained your entire life, for instance, to be, a builder or something like that, and suddenly your job is gone, it's not just a case of, I just need to invest a few more years of my life to become, a programmer or something. The old sort of meme of learn to code is that becomes incredibly disruptive to me, to my family, to my self-identity. So I think, the very kind of cold economic assumptions at the heart of neoliberal ideology are very disconnected from the sort of squishy reality of what it is to be a human. And they are so heavily embedded in the ideology of neoliberalism so you can't disaggregate them out. But when societies and individuals have been confronted with them and lived under regimes of these for decades, we have an entire generation who've come up under that. Many of them find it incredibly dissatisfying, and to the extent that we even have movements who will violently reject it now.
Do you think the pandemic has affected or strained the trust that we place in international organisations, like the World Health Organization, for example?
So I think when you say has it caused that kind of mistrust, I think maybe not from everyone. Is it because the US is making so much noise? I think they're pretty much a standout case because we pay attention to everything they say in the West. But so I don't know that we could say that we all have mistrust of it. I think maybe the WHO was slow, the World Health Organization was slow at declaring the pandemic. Maybe this is due to political pressure because there's the economic ramifications of that. There's funding that's tied to declaring a pandemic, like emergency relief and so on. And maybe that's, maybe there's some argument there about a loss of faith in global governing bodies. But I think there is some general mistrust of governing bodies, but it's only the WHO. So we got, the United Nations, IMF, and the World Bank, but they're not all being singled out. Someone like Trump is sowing discord with organisations like the World Health Organization, but they're not taking swipes at the IMF or the World Bank. So I think you have to think about which global governing bodies are important to certain key players. And how they and anything Trump says right now actually is really just a way of capitalising on feelings of disaffection amongst the populace because he's coming up for election again. So he wants to maybe use that in order for people to vote for him.
I would probably take Donna's argument a bit further. I mean, I think actually like the sort of the collapse in the trust in the WHO is really part of a broader trend that we've seen, emerge in the last over a decade. The sort of collapse of capacity and commitment to international institutions that really, I think, crystallized with the election of Donald Trump, but had been emerging, ever since really the GFC in 2008. I mean, I think if we look in the last just even 5 years, there's been, a real collapse in the confidence of regional bodies like the EU. And we've seen the US itself really begin to kind of hollow out the international architecture, of international cooperation that it spent the entire Cold War building. The withdrawal from the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal, which itself was really seen by many as a kind of triumph of this kind of global cooperative activity. The withdrawal from the Paris Climate Accords, the collapse of the TPP. These are organizations and agreements that traditionally the US would be championing, that would be leading, but instead we're seeing a pullback from them, not just from the US, but from many other kind of nationalist governments. If we look at Duterte in the Philippines. We look at Orban in Hungary. These are highly internationally skeptical governments that are rising and in many ways being driven by populist sentiment. So, I think there is a broader skepticism of the kind of manifestations of, globalization that we see in these same kind of institutions and norms.
And why is it with all of them? Is it with all of them because are they taking swipes at the World Bank or the IMF, or is it just the ones that countries, powerful countries like the US, no longer feel that they have complete control of? Which was the original idea, was it going to be a European, North American kind of consensus that in setting up those kind of some of those original central organisations, global governance organisations. Is it, and this is a genuine question, is it simply that it's the ones they know that they see other developed nations or developing and upcoming nations exerting more influence on, perhaps in things like the UN, the WHO, because I don't see them wanting to dismantle the IMF or the World Bank, whose leaders they still choose and who are made up of, the finance ministers of the contributing countries. World Trade Organization, it's the trade ministers and so on. It's a very narrow group, but could we still say that those are still controlled by the countries that are now agitating for the dismantling of other organizations? I guess I'm suggesting, or I'm asking, is it quite selective here? And is it about power?
No, I don't actually think it is. I think, it doesn't necessarily mean that the US is explicitly out to dismantle all of these organizations. But for instance, you cite the WTO there. The US has held up the election of the Pell judges in the WTO, which means that many of the core functions of the WTO have essentially ground to a halt. So they certainly, they haven't destroyed the institution entirely, but they're making it much more ineffective. The US's role in NATO is another good example of this. The US exerts overwhelming influence in NATO, yet it seems to be undermining that same international alliance. And I think there's an understanding that the United States never had full control of these institutions. You go back and you read about France's role in NATO during the 1960s, and that was always very problematic. But what the US understood this kind of array of international architecture to constitute was a means with which it could exert a significant amount of influence. That, yes, it had to make sacrifices to support these various institutions, but at the same time, in the long run, it helped the US shape the gradual nature of the international system, which was demonstrated in 91 when it came out on top of the pile at the end of the Cold War, and we had that unipolar moment. That was sort of the thing about paying off. But what the sort of election of Trump and these other populist leaders has kind of signaled is that the short term, the very transactional cost benefit view that in the short term, this isn't necessarily benefiting me right now, has seemed to come to the fore and seems to be guiding again and again and again the policies of states like the US and other countries in how they approach these, rather than approaching them as, well, this is a long-term investment for us.
How does our geographical location influence our sense of identity? And has this changed over time?
Interesting question. I actually think it shapes us quite a lot, and I think to the extent that we find connection with the physical land, it also helps construct our sense of belonging, and things like identity and belonging are not just tied to the physical world; they're closely tied to the social world. And so people within a particular nation state can form ideological and emotional connections to a place, but also to what is really only an imagined community. This is something that was suggested back in the 1980s, and it's really by Benedict Anderson, political scientist, but it's really held, I guess, people have found a chord with that idea. He was writing about nationalism, and he described how people saw themselves as belonging to what were essentially imagined communities, because they couldn't actually ever have meaningful interactions with all the people that they saw themselves as being connected to, but they could still identify with a sense of belonging to a particular nation, a particular physical state, or an idea of the nation state. And this gets, constructed and reinforced through literary and media accounts, and then reinforced through socialization, even when the actual reality might be quite different. And I think of a country like Australia, it's a modern multi-ethnic country, but there can be a vast difference between the official construction of the nation state as this singular entity that's based around a single official language, in our case it's English, as opposed to the actual lived reality of what we have is multiple languages and multiple cultures all coexistent within the borders of the same physical nation state. And so, I don't know, I think these connections, but even though they're connections to something imagined, but are made through language and cultural identity, they're good ways of mobilising the construction of the nation state, but they're always subject to ideological positioning that inevitably creates insiders and outsiders. So by constructing the nation as this single physical entity that gets expressed through the use of one language, you actually kind of needlessly exclude and erase what are, vast numbers of its citizens. And this impacts people's sense of identity and belonging within that nation state. So I guess a long answer, but I think, yes, there can be a connection to the physical land, but I think it's also very much tied up with the social world and the kind of forces that I'm describing there. I think I think about the nation state and the idea of the nation state, I would say it is necessary because people can come to think, well, do we even need to have countries? Is there a necessity for that? But I think it is necessary, and it's not just that it's a repository of self and other or forms of identity construction, but in order to support the flourishing of society, you need the nation state because it has to manage elements of the social contract like the law and, provision of financial and economic infrastructure, communications infrastructure, all of that. But it also plays a role in providing emergency support and other services that the private sector wouldn't consider profitable. And it's tremendously important, I think, in ensuring some kind of balancing in the distribution of income and wealth through mechanisms like progressive taxation systems or social services infrastructure. And all of this kind of moves us on from, if you go way back, sort of competing against each other or operating alone.
How can we solve global problems if we have countries like as you mentioned, like the US, for example, perhaps placing less stock in international organisations? Can we solve these international problems if we are becoming more inward-looking, or if we're not part of global organisations?
I think we can. I think we can do it less efficiently. I mean, we've been solving international problems ever since there was an international, and the efficiency is really the question. Yeah. And I think the reality is when we have a breakdown in institutions and we have a lack of trust in them, as we see with the WHO, the countries will, go it alone or go it more alone, and they will find their own particular approaches to things. And I think we've seen that in the case of the response to Corona. We had this incredibly decoupage kind of response out of various countries trying their own strategies, some of which have been more successful. Here at home in Australia, I think we've done probably one of the, if not the best jobs in containing it and balancing all the other things. There's a few other exceptions, such as like South Korea, New Zealand, but really we are at the top. But the reality is we have the failures of that kind of approach. I would say the United States, we have over 100,000 deaths there. We have social anarchy. We have all sorts of overflows, pulled back from those international, frameworks and sort of methods very quickly and decided to essentially go it alone. And we see what happens there. I think as we move forward, beyond this, and I think this is kind of the thing that keeps me up at night, is when we see things like global warming, whether or not that's going to be sustainable, because I think global warming is going to be a challenge internationally that is going to affect all of us, perhaps existentially. And if we continue to revert back to this kind of, inward-looking, go-it-alone approach, is that going to be able to fundamentally address the causes of global warming if we're just acting reflexively to it, if we're just weighing out our own individual approaches, our own emissions trading schemes, etc.? Or do we need to find some form of global governance? Now, whether or not that's possible is another question. We've had this 30 years to kind of come together and sort out global governance, and now we're seeing a reactionary pushback against it on across the international system. But it's certainly, I think, the more we can work together, we are humans, we are collective action beings, and when we do work together, we solve things more effectively, the better chances we have. Doesn't mean that nation states, as Donna points out very correctly, that nation states aren't very powerful, capable, potent forces, but at some point that potency does trail off when you get these sort of worldwide spanning problems.
Yeah, I think that's true, and I agree that for these problems like the problems with the environment, they know no borders, and so we have to have the political will to push for positive change at a global level. We can't withdraw into ourselves, into our countries, because we won't be able to solve the problem. It requires some sort of action at global level and some sort of agreement and so on. And I think I think that I was thinking, when you were talking, Ben, I was thinking of something, that thing about, you mentioned about us all being our shared humanity, I guess, and about where our sense of community or kinship sort of starts and ends. And I think of the kind of comments that were made by the feminist scholar and philosopher Judith Butler, and she talked about the idea that we don't choose who we cohabit the earth with, and so we have to honour the obligations to preserve other people's lives. Like she talks about, to preserve the lives of those we may not love and those we may never love or don't know and didn't choose, because those obligations come from the social conditions of political life, not from any agreement we have made or from any deliberate choice. So she's kind of saying we don't have to know and love someone in order to want to support their flourishing. We should do it because of our shared humanity and because there's no inherent privilege that flows from the accident of birth. And inequalities that happen between people in one nation, but also across the nations of the world, are the crystallization of historical and systemic global relations of power, and they have little to do with the individual. So it's like we have to step outside the idea of choosing who to love, as it were, and we should be focusing on our shared humanity when it comes to solving very, global scale vexing problems like climate change, the impacts of climate change.
Yeah, for sure. And I would sort of, it's a very positive way to look at it. I mean, I think unfortunately that the sort of the darker side of collective identity, and one of the things that the international the idea of the global citizenship has always struggled with is this the negative, which is that identities, and John Mearsheimer talks about this in his recent book on sort of the failure of liberal dreams. That he says that one of the real powerful parts of nationalism is it tells us what we aren't. So we define ourselves not just as through our common humanity, but through what we aren't, what parts of humanity we don't share that with. And I think that's something that we continue to struggle with through this day, because group identity at the core of it not only just tells us who we are, but tells us who we aren't. And that's a sort of a question that the neoliberal kind of approach and the idea of a global citizenship still has failed to really find an answer for. If we had an alien invasion, or potentially if we had a global threat that was very experienced by everyone, that might give us that external impetus, that external pressure to kind of collectivize. But again, the thing I worry about is by the time we're feeling that, is that going to be too late before something catastrophic happens?
Yeah, maybe, but I feel like climate change is that very thing that you're talking about that could mobilise the realisation of our shared humanity. And I think the idea of the us versus them has so many contradictions in it, because we can gather behind what, as I was saying before, is really an imagined community that is the nation state. But while at the same time within that nation state, we're multi-ethnic, we're multicultural, we're multilingual. So we are the world in a sense. So we have these weird contradictions in how we define our sense of identity. And I think that gets really influenced by the way politicians and leaders mobilise certain sentiments. So you get so many Australian politicians saying, Australians are this or Australians are that. And I always think, who do you mean by that? Who's us? Who's the us and them here? Because are you just thinking of one particular type of Australian who speaks your language or looks like you, or are you speaking about all? So there's these strange contradictions in how we establish identity based on borders or on sense of community and so on.
One of the things that the pandemic has done is it really has demonstrated our economic interdependence, how much we rely upon each other to be able to function as economies and as communities. Are international supply chains perhaps more fragile than we realise?
I would say, it has kind of shown the sort of the general international fragility. Now, this doesn't mean that we can't bounce back from it relatively quickly, but we have to sort of remember that for the most part, particularly for the last 3 decades, we've experienced a time of great fecundity. It's been relatively stable internationally, and it's allowed these these complex, interconnected supply chains between many countries to kind of flourish and crystallize. And now that we're seeing these shocks, this is being called into question. But I think, we look at products that are out there today and the amount of different, sourcings of materials, and we see that, something like, for instance, the F-35 fighter jet that Australia is currently taking on board, it takes parts from at least 20 different countries. Now, that's great during a time of peace and stability, but during times of uncertainty, this is perhaps not as sustainable. And we're seeing a number of these, particularly sort of right-wing authoritarian populist governments, call for more sort of forms of autarky, self-sufficiency, which ultimately costs more to everyone involved. In basic economics, you go and you sort of look at it, it's much better for you to focus on producing, a few things that you're good at rather than trying to do everything at a more costly method. These are questions and debates that are being had at home. Perhaps we are overextended. Perhaps it's not just a case of one or the other, but perhaps more degrees of self-sufficiency are better than just being completely beholden to this. So I think we will see, in response to COVID, a growth of some degree of some industries coming home. I think particularly medical industries. Oftentimes you see historically when you have crises that the supply chains that are particularly pertinent to that will come home. You saw this, for instance, in the US after World War II with the defense industry. But I don't necessarily think that, we're going to see countries skew towards autarky entirely. I don't think we're going to see sort of a replication of, what they do in North Korea with juice, which is, try and do everything at home. But I think there will be some degree of belt tightening.
It's progressively become easier to move capital and goods across borders. What about moving ourselves around and working across borders?
Yeah, that's always been one of the contradictions, I think, under neoliberal forms of globalization, that capital's been allowed to, they really, haven't been separate countries for capital for some time. It's been allowed to flow freely and without concern for geographical and political borders. It's just ordinary people who've continued to be contained by nation-state borders and quite aggressively as time's gone on. But it's hard to imagine it changing, even though if we look back in the past, there have been times when we've had free movement of labour. Some theorists have argued for some time that we should be allowed to return to that and allow things like market supply or supply and demand for labour determine where people go and sort of more organically control the global labour market in that way. People move to where the work is and then move away when the work dried up. This was the case for many years with things like the Mexico-US border. It was a very porous border for so many generations. There's a real history of Mexican people travelling into the US to take up really important jobs in agriculture and industry and keep those industries going, and then going back to Mexico when there was no work. And so we see problems with the tight border because, they've put that in place. All it does is create social problems because workers could not any longer move back and forth easily, and their families in Mexico and their lives in Mexico and their sense of belonging there. Now they have to either permanently be separated or risk all sorts of hardships by trying to bring their families and so on, and even bring themselves risk all sorts of hardships. And it's also created economic and logistical problems because in the US, because they now have to police the border. So there's all sorts of problems with stopping it, but there is this real. People talk about globalization as there's mobility regimes within globalization. I think some theorists talk about in the way that people are controlled quite tightly. Big business is allowed to go. Some professional class people have more ease of movement. They can actually participate in those flows. But for most workers, there's these really tight border controls. But it has been theorised that we should, as I say, loosen it up. I don't know whether it would work or not, but it would. What the theorists argue is that allowing that they say that labour is handicapped by being a prisoner of territory, and so allowing labour to move would be truly globalising. That other forms of economic activity are globalising, but not labour, not the movement of labour. So it's an interesting question. I'm not sure how it would work, but we do have examples from history, I guess is what I'm saying. Italians also, generations ago moved back and forth between the US. They're encouraged to from Italy because they thought, it would lead to insurrection if they stayed around with no job. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think it's a very multifaceted sort of problem, challenge, however you want to construe it. I mean, I think you look at the role of the nation state in relation to its own citizens. There's a big question here. I mean, I remember a long time ago, my old supervisor posed a question to me, how comfortable would you feel having to compete directly with, graduates of Yale for academic jobs here at home in Australia, which we do to some extent, but there also is some degree of protections of the state, in some ways seeks to sort of give more purchase to its own citizens than, say, people from outside. So there's a question of the responsibility of the state there. There's also the question of the social impact of having large demographics of people move around. The sort of the neoliberal worldview is that we should all be very comfortable with each other socially, culturally, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But we've seen again and again and again, when you see large demographics of people from external to a particular geographical space move into that space, it does cause all sorts of consternation, not necessarily because those demographics are going in and causing any particular problems, but because they are going in and being different to the local people there. I think if you look at, for instance, one of the things that really drove the Brexit vote, it was this sense of a lot of loss of, quotes, Britishness, whatever that may be, and the kind of subsequent reactionary pushback of people seeking to, get rid of the kind of free flow of labour and peoples that came with that into Britain by rehardening those borders. This isn't saying it's a good or a bad thing wholly, but that it is a reaction to these kinds of forces and that perceived loss of identity, that perceived loss of culture as you get more and more groups of people pushed up against each other. It also depends on the economic conditions. Studies have shown historically that during times of economic success and political stability, multicultural societies are very, very successful. They bring together all sorts of different ideas and peoples and perspectives and into a small space and get all sorts of new kind of things coming out of that. But at the same time, when there are points of economic downturn, political instability, those same division lines become often points of conflagration and conflict between people. There's a kind of schizophrenia there that, in certain conditions it can be very good and in certain conditions it can be very bad.
I think that gets cynically mobilised by political leaders as well, as we saw with Brexit. The kind of racism gets whipped up, not because for political gain on the part of people who are trying to mobilise those feelings, those ideas within the populace.
Absolutely.
Donna, is the ability to communicate in the same language a prerequisite for the global citizens of tomorrow?
I would say no, because it brings to the fore the idea of a single language has so many problematic ideological underpinnings, I guess, because if we think about what language is, it's not just a way of communicating, it's also a way of expressing culture. Languages are located in culture and people learn languages in social cultural settings. They learn it through that kind of early socialization to a culture, not just to a language. So you can't disconnect language from culture. they are they're completely interwoven. So if you talk about, in a sense, imposing or making people all speak one language, you're also eliminating cultures in doing that. And we've seen that quite a lot. We've seen that with the colonial project and even more recently with globalization and the way that the English language has come to the fore and it's considered a hyper-central language. It has so much influence globally, and so many people have been encouraged or forced or wanted to learn English because of being able to gain access to certain job markets and so on. But in learning, that pushed out other languages, and we don't just lose languages when we lose cultures as well. And I think you've probably touched on this in previous podcasts when you spoke to Alan Dench about linguistic imperialism. But so, yeah, I would say no. I think the focus should be, and I feel like that idea that there should be one language is probably coming more from people who only speak one language, and maybe that's English. So maybe that's a very developed world, English world kind of sentiment, because I think maybe the focus should be that we should be embracing more language, and that being able to speak more than one language should be the idea, not that it should be one language. Because whenever I hear one language, I think, oh, do you mean English, don't you? So I think it's a very problematic idea, and it also, you could look at it pragmatically and say, well, then everyone would understand each other and it would be really great. But I think it's sweeping under the carpet a whole lot of history and culture and individuality and difference and so on that goes along with language. You can't separate all of those things from language.
Well, I think we'll leave it there. Thank you very much, Donna and Ben, for coming in and for sharing phoning in.
My pleasure.
And for sharing your knowledge on this topic.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
You've been listening to The Future of, a podcast powered by Curtin University. If you have any questions about anything that we've raised today, you can get in touch by following the links in the show notes. Bye for now.